What's up, everybody? Welcome to Bios3 Raw TV. Today I'm going to put up a kind of sad, somber video about, and I wasn't going to do this video because I really didn't know how or any influence that this individual may have had on me. But Larry Scott passed away this past weekend, and for those of you who don't know who Larry Scott is, I mean, most of you probably do. If you're following bodybuilding, then you know that he's the first ever Mr. Olympia that there was. And he was known to have really great arms. Although he had great symmetry and a great overall look, he was very like regal looking. He had those movie star good looks. He had that, that kind of draw about him that, back then, everybody just was kind of drawn to him. He had that star power, I guess it would be called. And by the time I got into bodybuilding, which was in the early 90s, Larry wasn't really around anymore, wasn't competing anymore. He was still involved in the industry here and there. He would still make like appearances in magazines and stuff like that because he's always going to be known as the first in history Mr. Olympia. So I remember seeing pictures of him, Bill Pearl, Reg Park. I don't even know how to say that guy's name, but he was like a huge influence of Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the day when Arnold started. And their physiques were a little bit different. Obviously, there was different training methods. There was, different drugs, although Larry freely admitted that he used to take Dianabol. And he said back, and this is an interesting thing. I don't know how many people know this, but he said back when he was competing, they would take Dianabol. That's pretty much all they would take. That was what was available, and that's what they were using. And it was like 3 tablets. Okay, so it's like 15 milligrams of Dianabol. And I don't remember where I read this. I believe it was in a magazine that he was quoted talking about it. It was before, the internet came along. Actually, I don't know. Maybe it was after the internet came along because they were talking about how dosages today are so out of control. And Larry said they actually had a meeting, because back then they were legal. They had a meeting of a bunch of the bodybuilders and heads of the Bodybuilding Federation, which I would assume would be Joe Weider and those guys too. And they were trying to determine whether it was safe to go up to 4 tablets from 3. Because I think the original SIBA Germany tablets were 5 milligrams, and it said like 3 tablets per day. And they were trying to figure out whether or not it was safe to add that 5 milligrams a day. Now, fast forward, 25, 30 years, and, that's what they take every hour. It's like 5, D-ball, fucking all throughout the day. They're taking like 60 to 100 milligrams of D-ball. And so obviously, back then they were more cautious with it. And I guess you could say back then the physiques were more built, not based on drugs, obviously, but more based on trying new training techniques and trying to figure out what, previously hadn't been done. Now, Larry had these great arms. Now, of course, he had great genetics to have great arms, but to max out your genetics, you need to figure out how to do that. And since nobody had ever done it before, Larry was one of the first. So, and I don't remember what they taped at. I don't remember exactly how big they are, but they were big, full, round, thick triceps, long muscle bellies in the bicep, so it wasn't like a peak that made his arm look small when it was just hanging down by his side. When it was flexed, it just had this shape to it that was pretty much the best bicep in the world because he was Mr. Olympia. And I remember, reading some articles, on arm training because, Larry had the great arms and he would pop up still in magazines with arm training. And there was stuff called the Scott curls, that probably many people do nowadays because it's a technique that works. It's on a preacher bench, or they call it the Scott bench, the Larry Scott bench. But that wasn't really, Larry's physique didn't have a whole lot of influence on me because, by then they had the new physique stars like Dorian Yates and Levrone and those guys and Sean Ray. So it wasn't like he had an impact on me. Arnold kind of did, but not so much Larry Scott because he had already retired and been out of the competition scene. But as I'm reading about this guy, and it was like a repost in the magazine, there was a training technique he used for his biceps. And I remember reading this because I was like, this does not make fucking any sense at all, but whatever. So as he would do curls, let me do them from the side. As he was doing curls, he would actually, on the preacher bench, he would actually take his wrists and put them backwards and curl in this motion. So it wasn't locked in place like everybody, you have to keep them locked in place, you got to do this. They're back. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried this before, but get on like a cable apparatus or a preacher bench. Don't grab a heavy weight that you're struggling with. Grab something that you can do about 12 reps with and try to get 15 with it. All right? So now, right from the jump, as you pick up put your elbows in the thing, and as you start to go down, rotate those wrists back and just keep them back the whole time and just squeeze those biceps when you come up. This almost completely takes the forearm out of the movement. You don't feel that pull through the inside of your forearm. When you put your arm back, you can feel it really in the peak of the bicep. Now, it's not going to give you better peaks, but it's going to fatigue that bicep without fatiguing your forearm. Well, you're still going to fatigue your forearm, but it isolates the bicep. You can feel the bicep working more than the forearm. So if you're having issues where your forearms and wrists kind of give out and you're having a hard time isolating the bicep, that is a technique that still to this day that I use with clients when they're having a hard time feeling the bicep peak. That Larry Scott technique that I learned in a magazine. And they had pictures of him where he would take his elbows and tuck them way in and his arms would be way out and his wrists would be back and he'd be curling in like that fashion, like as far out as he could get them. Try that. Just try 3 sets of that with a weight that you can do 12 with, but try to get 15 with it. And then do 3 sets of some kind of cable, like easy bar, with your wrist back. And tell me that your biceps were not pumped to fuck and that you barely felt that in your forearms and it hit the bicep really hard. I mean, just amazing. And, you know, it took me, I don't know, maybe a couple of training sessions to get it down pat, to feel the way it really felt. But it worked. And that was a technique that was being used in the 60s. And it gets lost over time. It gets forgotten because you got these guys swinging 100-pound dumbbells around, you know, whereas Larry Scott would curl like a 40-pound dumbbell using that type of technique. And yes, the guys have big arms now, but they're fucking pumping all sorts of shit in them too. So you don't even know what's real muscle, what's not. But at least, you know, Larry Scott back then, I believe he had, I can't remember what they taped at, but they were over 20 inches, I believe. And there was no synthol. And they weren't injecting fucking site injections with propionate and shit. They weren't putting PGF2 in there. They weren't putting IGF in there. They weren't putting anything in there. And he developed that big, full, thick bicep, which again was his genetics, but he maxed out his genetics. So who the fuck knows? You may have genetics like that, but you're never going to max them out unless you train right. Give this a shot. I mean, give it a little bit different a feel. So, you know, in closing, I'll say rest in peace, Larry Scott, the original Mr. Olympia, the first Mr. Olympia, and, you know, for the rest of the world's history, that's who he's going to be to me. He's going to be the first Mr. Olympia and the guy that I learned how to isolate my biceps from. bioctraining@gmail.com. Leave comments down below, but don't fight. Just try the bicep technique. www.bioctraining.com is the blog, and where this is the Larry Scott technique built bicep, and we're out.
Extreme. Make plans to be at the 2014 Blue Ridge Fitness Festival, April 26, 2014. Mark the Machine Lowbliner brings the ANBF Natural Bodybuilding Show to Roanoke, Virginia. Extreme Living brings Jerry Ward of Bios3 Training. More information can be found at extremeliving.biz. We'll see you there.